The audience was distinctly international. Every nation was represented, some in traditional costumes, some in exquisitely designed clothes. The woman sitting next to me, according to her name tag, was from Sweden. She wore a long black evening gown, and a black vest graced by a simple silver chain. I was captivated by her appearance, but also by something else about her. Her gown was more designed for easy walking and dancing than for sitting in tightly spaced theater seats. Whenever she crossed her legs, the fabric would part and reveal her beautifully shaped legs that were more attractive to look at than the finest silk dress. She didn't seem to notice, or pretend not to notice, my interest. The thought that she might let the sharing happen, as an element of sharing her humanity, made the moment even more exciting, so that I couldn't help but respond to it. It created a feeling of closeness and of gentle peace, a peace that was also reflected in the music of Mozart's piano sonata that was performed from the vast volume of Mozart's compositions. Perhaps the piano piece had been chosen for its simple, soft melody, where nothing is forced and overpowering, or abstract, or remote, where the beautiful moment unfolds naturally. The melody reflected the peace of the satisfaction that I felt. It wasn't underscored by an unfulfilled longing, but by an exciting sense of peace. This peace was carried by the sufficiency of the moment that seemed complete in itself. The feeling of sufficiency and the peace that flowed from it lingered. During the intermission, I found it reflected as a feeling of gratitude for just being there among so many beautiful people, some with beautiful smiles and gentle and proud gestures. When the concert finally ended, the Swedish woman, who was still sitting next to me, stood up and turned away to leave. Except as she did, she turned back momentarily with a big smile, which I promptly returned. For this brief moment there was a link established that might have said more than all of Steve's words. She didn't growl with an angry look, nor was it a look of indifference that reflected a mere accommodation of my evident needs. Her smile was bright, like a note of thanks, like she was saying, "Thank you for noticing me, for acknowledging that I exist, that I am a beautiful human being worthy to be loved and admired." I didn't realize at that moment that her smile reflected something far greater than I had understood. For the moment I treasured the smile and the gentle expression that accompanied it. I treasured the brightness of the moment. It stood in contrast to the many angry expressions that I saw in many other faces. Sometime later I saw the Swedish woman again outside of the auditorium. She stood alone in front of a fountain. The spray of the fountain sparkled in the sunshine. I walked towards her, almost by instinct, but also reluctantly against my innermost fears and against my timidity, all of them fighting for dominance, to stop me. Who was I to approach such a beautiful person? "Don't do it," said a voice within. I must have smiled at myself when I actually succeeded. "Would you kindly allow me to invite you for a cup of coffee?" I said to her, almost trembling, as if facing a firing squad, ready to be shot down. "You are most perfectly welcome to do that," she answered, and curtsied slightly to make her reply match the style of my silly way of asking. Then she laughed. "The coffee shop's on the second floor. Shall we take the stairs?" I felt stupid to be speechless. Still I managed to ask somehow to be forgiven for my rashness in asking her. I added that someone as lovely and beautiful and as kind as she was must also be a beautiful person that I really wanted to meet, though I almost didn't have the nerve to ask. She replied with the same warm smile that she gave me in the auditorium, saying that a long time ago she found herself in a similar situation. She said that she had come to America as a tourist. She had read stories about the wide-open hospitality of the American people. So, there she was. She said she was in Florida, traveling with a tour group. The tour had stopped at a hummock in the Everglades, an oasis of trees, in a wide world of shallow open waters. She said that she had relished the narrow walkways of the hummock, threaded through its jungle-like setting, and the private seclusion that some of the lookout places provided, all the while hoping for her prince to appear in this setting. She said she pictured him romantically emerging from somewhere out of the crowd of tourists that always converge at the tour stops. People had come on these tours from all over America, and maybe the world. "And?" I asked. She shook her head slightly and smiled. "Nothing happened, nothing at all. Nothing of that sort happened that day, the day after, or on any other day," she replied. Strangely, she said this with a smile, and her smile was getting brighter. "That must have been a lonely holiday for you," I said, somewhat perplexed by the smile, "but it is all history now, right?" "No, it wasn't a lonely holiday at all. It became a beautiful holiday," she replied with a grin now. "It became a revelation." As we were seated with our coffee at a table for two by the window, she continued her story. "So, there I stood, at the end of a path leading to a lookout, overlooking the Everglades, the most perfect spot for a romance to begin, but there was no prince in sight, such as I hoped there would be. Not a single person had sought me out. No one was there to love me, no one was there at all, except me and myself. Then, suddenly something clicked in my head. Why not love yourself? A voice kept saying to me from within. And did I have an answer ready? Self-love is more opaque than a solid body, I said to myself, and turned that suggestion away. I had read this in a book. I really believed it, too, which of course is true for the kind of self-love that manifests itself as greed, possessiveness, dominance, arrogance, and so forth. But at that moment I also realized that self-love can have a second meaning. On a higher level, where it can mean the opposite. Can you understand what I am saying? I suppose you looked in a mirror and fell in love with yourself, I said jokingly. I certainly would have if I were you. That's exactly what happened, except the mirror was in my mind. I looked at myself through that mirror. As I did so, I realized that I am a lovely, intelligent, sentient human being, capable of a great deal of joy and humor, and also love, endowed with the capacity for rich and interesting experiences. I realized right there and then that I simply didn't need to wish for anyone else to be with me. I felt complete in myself. I began to take note of myself and to love what I saw. At the end of the bus ride that day, in a town called Flamingo, I treated my newfound friend to a fine steak and shrimp dinner, and I appreciated the gesture all at the same time. After supper we went for a boat ride together through the 10,000 Islands area of the lower Everglades, just me and my newfound self. We were sitting right up at the front of the boat. And you know, that became a most wonderful trip to end a wonderful day. That's an incredible story, I said, and I meant it. You didn't talk to yourself, though, I hope. Of course not. The dialogue was all mental. But then, we are always in a dialogue with ourselves whenever we think about anything. And this includes you too. No doubt, you had quite an interesting dialogue going on with yourself when you had treated yourself to that sexual experience that you had in the auditorium earlier, during the concert. I blushed. Don't worry, my friend, she said, and smiled. Remember, I am the champion when it comes to treating oneself. But be honest, was it a beautiful experience? I nodded and said, thank you, quietly. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. No thanks are needed, she replied. I felt enriched by it as much as you were, just by knowing that I am not the only freak who finds a great peace in embracing oneself. You found in me an echo of that embrace of yourself. Evidently you found no need to go further with this. Am I right? I nodded, and closed my eyes momentarily, as if this would keep the mental vision alive, and engrave her lovely smile into my mind. I wanted to keep that vision alive. Isn't it amazing in how many ways it is possible to treat oneself with all those wonderful aspects of our humanity? Said the woman when I opened my eyes again. Her smile had become a grin. It is also amazing how much we need this, she added moments later, and how easily this need is satisfied. It appears to me that it took you a great deal of courage, said the woman, when you approached me against all those voices crying within that would hold you back, right to the very last moment. But you overruled their crying. Do you remember what you said? Would you kindly allow me to invite you for a cup of coffee? That was as much a request to yourself as to me. Your face lit up like a sun when I said yes. Those small things are sometimes the most beautiful treats that we give to ourselves. And to one another, I added. How could I have possibly said no, she replied, if my part in this is such a small one? The impetus for it was all your own. It came out of the great heart of our humanity in which all love is rooted, that we all share universally and are able to acknowledge with joy. Isn't life beautiful when this happens? I agree. It is beautiful if we aren't too scared to embrace it, I replied. You must have had beautiful experiences then, treating your friend, I said a while later while embracing her in my thoughts, including her smile that was so honest and so penetrating to the very heart of the love. I was never really indulging myself, she said moments later. I was treating myself with the same loving and consideration with which I would have gladly treated the dearest friend. I also realized right from the beginning that I didn't step into a fairy tale world by doing this. I am convinced that all people are naturally generous and loving. They just don't give themselves a chance to experience it. What caused you to realize that? I asked when she almost blushed for some reason. I learned this from a businessman, she said quietly. Then she really blushed, as if she said something that is hard to believe. He wasn't a stockbroker or something like that, she added. He was a small-scale manufacturer. His experience in selling his product has been that people are more than willing to be helpful. He said to me, just go into any store and ask for direction to somewhere and people will help you. They may even draw you a map. He made this process into be a two-way street. He found that no high-pressure sales pitches were needed to sell his products, because he saw himself as the bringer of goods that would enrich their life. He didn't come to them to get, but with an opportunity to enrich their world. In this environment, people came to him and asked for his products. He told me that he always endeavors to give a portion of his success back to humanity in order to keep the process alive that enriches the world on which his business is built. I have merely adopted this process towards myself, said the Swedish woman named Astrid, according to her name tag. She said that if people are naturally loving and generous, then I can be so to myself, to me, to Astrid. And you know, that means a great deal to me now. So you see, my friend, what I did wasn't done out of pity, as it might have been done, but out of love. I am always careful not to waste my emotions on pity, either for myself or for anyone else. Life is too precious for it to be wasted like that. She said that the results that came out of this alertness have always been amazing. I can recommend it to anyone. I have never looked back to the olden days, once I began to love in this fashion, she said. The dark ages have ended. Of course, it wouldn't make any sense looking back, because I have pulled myself up onto a higher level of living in which the old world is no longer relevant. She told me that she never felt lonely again after her healing that day in the Everglades. She told me that this single experience of that day in the Everglades totally changed her life. She said it brought into focus what she had somehow always believed but had never lived up to. She added with a smile that this process of living up to a wider reality is still unfolding. She urged me to be alert of the fact that there is always something new to be discovered in the wide world, of loving oneself and of embracing the whole world in that love. When the end of our meeting came, as the end always does, long after the coffee was gone and we were leaving the coffee shop, I asked her in my exuberance if we could possibly meet again. What for? She asked, and embraced me. What good would that do? If you love yourself fully, as I know you will in time, what more could I possibly add to that fulfillment? If anything, I would be a hindrance. The world is full of beautiful people with interesting faces and loving hearts that you might want to treat yourself to meeting. We are all a part of the same humanity, are we not? I think it is the greatest treat in the world to give ourselves the chance to find this out and experience the boundless riches we find there. On the way out, I dared to ask her to reconsider. Why shouldn't we be able to meet over coffee again, or perhaps for dinner? I asked. She smiled. I hear what you are saying. But these things won't stop there, will they? They tend to become private, and intimate, and narrow. I hesitated answering. Self-love is a wonderful thing, I said cautiously as we came near to the door, but it doesn't need to lead to self-isolation. I fear there is something missing if it does. I feel that there is something spiritually lacking in self-isolation. No universal principle that I know supports self-isolation. I think you may be cheating yourself along this route by not taking the next step. My friend Steve in East Germany told me that universal love isn't a duty, by which one is duty-bound to love universally, but is a principle that forges wide and universal bonds. He suggested that the reality of self-loving unfolds the other way around, than loving in self-isolation. He said that universal love is the environment in which we live, that surrounds us, that we cannot get away from, like the air that we breathe. He says it rests on everything, the grass, the trees, the birds in the air, the fish in the rivers, and on men and women and children. He said we find its substance in every smile, every hug, every kind thought and deed, in every kiss, every intimacy, also in sex, in joy, and in building great works that enrich our world, as well as in art that brings beauty to it, and in music, and laughter, and poetry, and all the other wonderful things that we do as human beings. Universal love is the universal human environment, which he says, it is our privilege to open ourselves up to, a wonder for us to experience. I think this would be the kind of playground on which we could safely meet again, you and I, not as beggars begging each other, but as fellow travelers who are mutually enriched by life's riches. Why would you want to close the door to all of that? I fear that you might choose self-isolation into an empty world. Maybe I do, or maybe not, Peter. However, I see a beautiful precedent for what I am doing. The precedent exists in the greatest historic advance in civilization. That is what the headscarf represents, which is worn by Muslim women around the world. I think they call it hijab. Hijab is an ancient custom that was designed to give a woman the freedom to be herself. It doesn't isolate the woman from men, but offers her a sanctuary. Hijab came out of the greatest spiritual renaissance that I know of, which raised the status of woman way beyond anything that existed up to that time. Hijab gave her a space to be, and to be at peace with herself and to live quietly without intrusions. These aspects are essential for a person's self-development as a human being. Hijab has kept the sexual in a relationship at a manageable level. Evidently it is still needed in modern times when so much of a woman's worth is judged by sexual appearances. I want to stay away from that intrusive environment. Wasn't the Islamic hijab a part of a world that existed hundreds of years ago? I almost protested. The world has changed. Does a woman still need the scarf to hide behind? Have we not progressed beyond that? Hijab is an aspect of principle, Peter, said Astrid. Principle is timeless. It is always valid, Peter. So don't be hasty to throw away what was once a part of the greatest renaissance in history. I am talking about the Islamic Renaissance that began in 780. It truly changed the face of civilization. In fact, without the Islamic Renaissance, you and I might not exist. The USA might never have been established. The whole world might have been radically darker with far fewer people living in it, existing at a precarious state of existence. But you are right. There exists a need in the world to always advance beyond the brightest of the past. For example, the USA was founded on the Second Renaissance that gave the world the Peace of Westphalia. Furthermore, the Second Renaissance was built on the First European Renaissance, the Golden Renaissance, that emerged out of Italy 3 centuries earlier. Of course, the Golden Renaissance itself was created on the foundation of the Islamic Renaissance. We've taken the oldest awakening of mankind and moved forward with it. I think we may have done the same also with what hijab once represented. So it remains alive as something that is of great value. I find hijab beautiful in its basic design, Astrid continued. I find its principle so enriching that I am reluctant to let go of it completely without a good reason. So far, I have not discovered such a reason. Can you understand what I am saying, Peter? I nodded. Yes, I hear you, I said. However, you might be clinging to an ancient tradition for nothing more than the sake of tradition, I said cautiously. You might also be wrong assuming that the founding of the USA was a direct result of what happened 14 centuries ago in the world of Islam. Astrid shook her head and suggested that the answer has to be no, on both counts. I am not clinging to ancient traditions, she said. I find value in what was a part of a development that uplifted civilization far more than what is generally acknowledged. The Islamic Renaissance is virtually unknown today. That is true, I said quietly in agreement. Everybody knows about the Golden Renaissance that changed the face of Europe. Astrid nodded. Hardly anybody is aware that the Golden Renaissance would never have happened had the Islamic Renaissance not prepared the ground for it during the preceding 6 centuries. Likewise, only a few people realize that the founding of the USA was the direct outcome of the Golden Renaissance in Europe, that led to the profound developments that came after it, that created the Second Renaissance in Europe, right in the middle of the 30 Years' War. The entire world would be radically darker, Peter, if the Islamic Renaissance hadn't happened, which gave rise to all that. The Golden Renaissance wouldn't have happened then, and every other Renaissance thereafter might not have occurred. That's the kind of huge shift in thinking that I am talking about. By all accounts, the accumulative cultural impact of the Islamic Renaissance was immense. It was profound. And the more I think of it, the more I stand in awe before it. I am clinging to a universal idea, not to tradition, Peter. I am clinging to something that is rooted in a world-shaping Renaissance power. That's what I see reflected in the principle of hijab. I cannot throw this away. Surely, you can understand this, can't you? While I was searching for an answer, Astrid had spotted a woman in the lineup coming into the coffee shop, wearing the Islamic hijab. She pointed her out to me, and then introduced us. May I ask you a bold personal question about hijab? She said to the woman. Could you kindly explain to my American friend the significance of hijab, and why Muslim women are wearing it? According to her name tag, the woman that Astrid addressed was from Baghdad, named Mahja. She, in turn, introduced her husband, Jamal, standing next to her. Your question is an easy one to answer, said the woman to me moments later. Hijab is a gift from Allah to all the women of humanity. I wear it with pride. It gives me dignity. Hijab is telling the world that we women are not dependent on whether anyone in society finds us beautiful to be loved, but that it is important to us that we find ourselves to be beautiful, and are thereby at peace with ourselves and with the world. Hijab makes me feel beautiful as a person, and dignified by wearing it. It is also a symbol of our love for Allah. She turned to Astrid. Our men are not required to wear hijab, she said, but they are demanded to respect what it symbolizes. Every time they see a woman wearing hijab, they see it as a symbol of the same obligation to themselves as human beings. In a sense, we women are wearing hijab for them, out of love. We are wearing hijab for ourselves and for all men, but we do it out of our love for Allah. Her husband, Jamal, explained that Allah is the Islamic name of the only true God, a name that really stands above religion. Therefore, Allah has neither gender nor physical form, said Jamal, and can only be recognized as singular and universal. The plural sense of Allah is not possible. Such a concept is totally invalid. It would destroy the face of Allah, because Allah already means all, the all in all. There is no plural sense possible for all. The name Allah is a double term, really. It means all and all combined into one. We stand in awe before the universal law. Allah is all power, all being. We human beings, women, men, and children, are one with this universal law. This prevents us from speaking down to our children, interrupted Mahja. It also prevents us from becoming servants to them, and likewise to one another. You may associate Allah with the power that orders the universe, said Jamal. I believe your scientific name for Allah is principle, or more precisely, universal principle. What you know about the universal principles of the universe, we know about Allah. The concept is the same. We know Allah as the most gracious, the most merciful, the all-powerful, the all-loving, and eternal. Allah is universal principle. No one can own it. We simply stand in awe before it. That is what Allah really means to us. It means all and all combined into one single concept. Allah is an indivisible concept, said Mahja. Allah is also absolute good. It is the principle of the universe, in its countless expressions, which is necessarily good. The expressions of principle have to be good, because it is inconceivable for a principle to manifest itself in self-contrary expressions. If this were the case, principle would be self-defeating, which is not possible. We recognize Allah as natural good, because no other expression of principle is possible than natural good, Jamal continued. That is how you must see Allah. You must see Allah as natural good. Should one not stand in awe before that realization? We call Allah the most gracious and the most merciful. You may say the same about the principle of universal love and universal sovereignty, and so forth. Wouldn't you then say the same thing about these principles? Wouldn't you then, in acknowledging their reality, stand in awe before them as we do before Allah? Wow, was all I could say. This is what we do 5 times a day. We bow before Allah 5 times each day, said Jamal. Sometimes we pray consecutively without a break, combining 2 prayers. Nevertheless, we bow before the universal principle of the universe, in which is bound up the reality of our being. And we do more than bow. We kneel before Allah in prayer. In doing so, we remind ourselves that we are at one with the universal force for good. In prayer we renew our dedication to everything that Allah is. Shouldn't we do this 5 times a day? The first prayer is done at pre-dawn, reminding ourselves that God is reality. At noon we break to remember God and seek guidance. In the late afternoon, when we are beginning to wrap up the day's work, getting kids home from school, and so on, we find it to be important for us that we take a few minutes out of our day to look to God, where we find the greater meaning of our lives. Then just after the sun goes down, we take a few moments out to celebrate God again, as our day begins to come to a close. And in late evening, before retiring for the night, we again devote some time to contemplate God's presence, guidance, mercy, and forgiveness. In this manner we remind ourselves that we, as human beings, are a part of the universal law, and have a role to play in honoring Allah, by being alive ourselves as the tallest species of life in the universe. We see our role as representing the nature of Allah, and to bring His good delight in our life, in the form of peace, harmony, mercy, and goodness. That is what worship is to us, the way I see it. And for this reason, my dear friend, we face in prayer towards Mecca or Medina, where the greatest man in history became a prophet for Allah. The name of the prophet is Muhammad. He gave us the highest scientific concept of God that has ever been envisioned. As I said, you may call Allah a universal principle, or the principle of universal love, or the principle of economics, or the science of civilization. We only have one name for all these principles, the name Allah. Why do you call Muhammad a prophet? I asked cautiously. Isn't that obvious? Said Jamal. He prophesied the universal recognition of Allah, the recognition of universal principle, including the principle of universal love, as an inevitable recognition. He prophesied what you are already bringing out in your life. Muhammad recognized this inevitable universal unfolding. It was an easy prophecy to make. Allah is inevitable, interrupted Mahja. Civilization is inevitable. Civilization is inevitable, because Allah is inevitable manifestation. Allah is principle, the principle of our being. And it's manifest, just as it is the principle of the universe. Shouldn't the unfolding of Allah in our life be inevitable too? Some people say that the Islamic Renaissance ended in the 16th century, said Jamal. I would say that the real Islamic Renaissance has not even begun, considering its potential and its scientific basis. To Muhammad, Allah was holy because principle is absolute. That is what holy means. Holy is that which defies hierarchical thinking to its very core. We still have to learn to discover that. In defying hierarchical thinking, we find ourselves standing side by side with one another and equal in Allah. Every spark of life, especially human life, represents the all-in-all of universal principle and its awe-inspiring dimensions. Allah defines it as a privilege to be a human being with a mind that makes us one with the universe and one another. Jamal paused, searching for words. When we speak of Allah as the most merciful and the most gracious, then that is what we aim to reflect in our life. Life and love are universal. We don't aim to emulate Allah, but we do aim to live up to the supreme standard that Allah is and bestows on us. We do it to reflect its nature, in which great peace is found. Peace is an active quality, a quality that reflects Allah. It unfolds from a high regard for oneself and one another. It also comes to light in what hijab represents. That is why we call hijab a gift from Allah. Jamal turned to Mahja and hugged her. One day we will be able to lay hijab aside, he said to her. This happens when the universal principle, or Allah, is fully established in our heart and becomes its own imperative. Then, when the real is established, we won't need the symbol anymore. Didn't Moses lay the groundwork for that? I interjected. His 10 commandments are hijab in the larger sense. On the surface they are all passive demands. They tell society that one mustn't do this and that. However, I see an active principle behind each passive demand. When this principle is recognized as already rooted in our heart and soul, then the active principle becomes so profound in our living and so uplifting that it becomes forever impossible for us to violate the passive demands. Muhammad stood on this same kind of platform, added Jamal. From this platform of active principles, which he called collectively Allah, it was impossible for him to kill another human being. Allah made it impossible for him to kill, or to injure, or even to avenge the most terrible atrocity. The worst atrocities that were committed against him and his people, of which there were many, were forgiven without a thought for revenge. This forgiving included even the horrible atrocities that were committed against his own beloved uncle, who had been ripped apart alive and mutilated, and his liver ripped out and chewed on, as a gesture of his enemies having power over him. Muhammad is said not to have raised his hand when vengeance was put before him as an option, but had proclaimed, I trample under my feet all what divides man, and the hatred between man and man. To Muhammad, the term Allah included the principle of universal brotherhood and the equality of all mankind, said Jamal. Without that, the concept of Allah as universal principle would have no meaning. We need to get back to that sense of humility and humanity, I interjected. Oh, have you changed your opinion about Islam? Said Jamal to me. If this is so, hijab is no longer a trivial relic then, of an irrelevant antiquity, but represents a universal principle that is rooted in our heart, as human beings. You are not excluded from that. No one is excluded from universal principles and their manifestation in human living. I regard what you said as evidence of your own unfolding love for Allah, as the principle of the universe, and of your own being, something that you want to discover further, scientifically. What else would have caused you to say that we need to get back to that? You find value in something great, something that is greater than the small concept of oneself. It is something that once changed the course of mankind and the shape of its history. Did you know that the great prophet, Muhammad, had said the very same thing that you have said? Said Hijab to me before I could reply. The ravishing of Rome had dragged civilization to such a low level that Muhammad appears to have recognized that mankind simply cannot go on like that. He also recognized that there was no need to do so. Muhammad appears to have responded, as a human being, to the ever-darkening civilizational crisis that Rome had set in motion. he had responded by drawing together into a single visual construct all the universal principles of the universe and of our humanity that he knew, said Jamal. That is how his discovery began. I know somebody, the woman, who had experienced such a process, I said to Jamal. She beheld a profound visual construct in responding to a need for healing. The healing of a friend. It appeared to her as though she was taken by the hand and was shown what is real about the dynamics of the human world. With that, the needed healing happened by the power that she beheld. It may well be possible that Muhammad was shown the same sort of thing in his mind in a different context, which may have brought to light profound aspects of truth that he had never been consciously aware of before. He may have literally experienced God unfolding before him as infinite mind in which is rooted the power and the order of the universe. Obviously, Muhammad stood in awe before this all-embracing reality, beholding its majesty, just as my friend Helen stood in awe before what she saw as the reality of our being. In this context, I can recognize Muhammad as a prophet, I said to Jamal. He was a prophet in the sense that he was a pioneer who recognized the power and majesty of universal principle before anyone else had, suggesting, as he did, that the unfolding human understanding that he had become a part of would inevitably be universal. So, as a prophet, he recognized, as it were dawning in consciousness, what is inevitable for the whole of human society to embrace and to come to terms with. Am I right? It appears to me that he beheld the reality in which the future of humanity is rooted, without which humanity is in grave danger and has no hope, as was well demonstrated in the days of Rome. Or as may be demonstrated in the fast-approaching days of the impending Ice Age, that the world's honest scientists are expecting soon, maybe in 100 years, added Jamal. Muhammad was a prophet, therefore, in the sense of being a scientific pioneer who paved the way for us to come out of our shell of small-minded thinking. What are you talking about? Astrid interrupted Jamal. The whole world is talking about global warming. And you are worried about the coming Ice Age. Jamal just laughed. Global warming is a fairy tale, my dear. It's designed to entertain children. The International Panel on Climate Change, called IPCC, is worried about a man-made global temperature rise of 0.2 degrees over the next 100 years. The planet experienced a 10 times larger warming 6,000 years ago, and this completely without industrial pollutants. The much warmer climate didn't cause a catastrophe either. To the contrary, it put mankind on the map by enabling the great agricultural revolution that caused the development of modern civilization. The warming that the Earth had been experiencing historically, and is experiencing a little again today, was all caused by solar variances, as was the Little Ice Age, in more recent times between the 14th and 18th century. My dad, who is presently teaching in Baghdad, is in touch with a Polish fellow, Zbigniew Jaworowski by name, who has excavated ice samples out of 17 glaciers on 6 continents for almost 50 years. The evidence that he finds supports what is generally known about the Ice Age cycles, namely that Ice Age conditions are normal for our planet, but are interrupted every 100,000 years by warm periods, like the one we are in now, which is about to end. Allah is truth, said Mahja. We dishonor Allah when we close our eyes to the truth, no matter how inconvenient the truth may appear. The lie, no matter how small or for what reason, is a slap into the face of Allah. Science is a gift of Allah, as it opens the door to truth and its countless aspects that only the mind can see, because Allah is mind. The evidence that Jaworowski sees as truth, said Jamal, is that the Earth is a greenhouse, which is 97% to 98% caused by water vapor, and only 2% to 3% by CO2. This is the reality that he sees. The global warming by carbon gases, that the IPCC wants the world to dream about, is a lie. It is a slap into the face of Allah, as Mahja has put it. If all the CO2 were to disappear in the world, the greenhouse effect would be reduced by only 3%. However, if the water vapor were to disappear, the CO2 would then be highly important, as the only major factor remaining to maintain the greenhouse, though at a very low level. we would be in a deep ice age. The CO2 factor, therefore, becomes important only during an ice age, when the water vapor effect becomes reduced, and for that it is actually dangerously low. All this is scientifically supported truth, but the IPCC lies about in the pursuit of its destructive, imperial, political agenda. They cry that mankind has to sacrifice its living to reduce the carbon gases, while they know that the opposite is true. Instead of being dangerously high, the present CO2 level is at such a deep historic low that it may become a dangerous factor during the next ice age. On the geologic scale, the atmospheric CO2 content has been constantly diminishing. It is presently at an all-time low. That's the fact that the IPCC's global warming lies covering up. The current low CO2 level is threatening to cause a more severe ice age coming up, and if the trend is not reversed, it might cause in future ice ages the complete freeze-up of our planet. That's what the Russian fellow, by the name of Budiko, is warning about. By this you can tell the real scientist that tells the truth, apart from the riffraff. I thought we are facing a global warming crisis, instead of an ice age crisis, said Astrid, interrupting Jamal. Everybody is worried over the vast increases in CO2 levels since the industrial age began. You are worried by a lie, said Mahja. Jaworowski laughs at this nonsense, said Jamal. The vast increases that they talk about don't exist. They are imagined. The public is fed lies. The lies are based on intentionally false interpretations of the ice core data. Even scientists sometimes fall into the trap of lies. People tend to see what they want to see. Sometimes they see a ghost and think it's real, and so they lie to themselves. Unfortunately, on this route the truth is lost sight of. Sure, there has been an increase in the CO2 levels since the beginning of the industrial age, but this minuscule increase is far less than one would wish to see, certainly far less than would be needed to soften the severity of the coming ice age. The minute man-made increase in greenhouse gases during the industrial age might help us a tiny bit during the next ice age, but not enough to make up for the existing historic deficiency. Budiko suggests we should be burning all the fossil fuels that we can lay our hands on, and this not only to soften the coming ice age, but also to give the biosphere a boost, which thrives on carbon gases, and which are presently at near starvation levels. Jaworowski points out that the present global warming began 300 years ago with the reversal of the last little ice age, and that this warming trend began long before the age of the automobile, and large-scale power plants, and industrial production. And even now, we are only halfway back to the warmer climate we had before. Mankind didn't cause the warming that got us out of the little ice age. The changing conditions in the universe did this, just as the changing conditions in the universe had caused the little ice age in the first place, and all the big ice ages, and the exceptional warm periods in between. The changing climate of the Earth is a function of major variances in solar cycles that are affected by galactic events of a type that affects the water vapor content of the Earth's atmosphere. This sounds like science fiction, Astrid interrupted Jamal. In the world of lies, the truth sounds like fiction indeed, said Jamal. This is why truth is important when facing Allah, said Mahja. A lie is a denial of Allah. This is why Islam is under attack, said Jamal. In order to protect their lie, the liars attack whoever stands for telling the truth. They want the truth not to be heard. Except they cannot alter the truth. The fact remains that climate changes on Earth, for example, are natural phenomena. The water vapor content in the atmosphere varies with the intensity of cloud formation, and the cloud formation in turn varies with the intensity of the cosmic radiation from outer space that ionizes the troposphere. Nothing changes these facts. The cosmic radiation, in turn, is affected by periodic changes in solar activity, like the sun's magnetic storms, and solar winds that deflect some of the cosmic radiation away from the Earth. We don't know yet precisely what causes the large solar variances that have caused the Big Ice Age epoch that the Earth got drawn into starting 5 million years ago, and what causes the solar variances that pull the Earth out of that Ice Age deep freeze for 10,000 years in every 100,000 year period. We only know that these cycles are happening because we see the evidence of it. We can't see the evidence with our mind because we are human beings. To deny the truth that we see is an act of self-denial. The world is full of this kind of denial, I interjected. It is well understood that our sun, like any other sun in the universe, is electrically powered by vast electric currents flowing in space in the form of plasma that makes up 99.999% of the mass of the universe. The Pliocene epoch that began 5 million years ago, when Antarctica began to freeze up, and later the additional cooling that gave us the Pleistocene epoch, which started 2 million years ago, are both easily explained in electric cosmology as variations in electric intensity. Even the interglacial warm periods are easily explained as a natural phenomenon of electric cycles, considering the size of our galaxy. It takes roughly 100,000 years for electric currents to make a single round trip across our galaxy. What we thereby see with the mind matches the evidence that we can't see with the eyes. Both speak of one truth. The truth that we see promises us great freedoms as human beings, as it offers an unlimited energy resource existing all around us in space, waiting for us to tap into. Of course, the truth that gives us this potential freedom is denied to exist by the masters of empire, whose existence is based on looting mankind, which would not be possible if mankind were to develop itself and realize its potential. You just affirmed what I said Mahja. The denial of the truth is a slap in the face of Allah. It is a tragic thing when it happens. That is why we must alert ourselves 5 times a day of the wonders that we find in the truth and what freedoms it offers. The lie blinds us, said Jamal. We know, for example, that during the Little Ice Age a few hundred years ago, the solar activity was so low that very few sunspots were observed. I believe only 50 sunspots were observed during the entire Little Ice Age period, compared to the 50,000 we see today for the same period. We know that these variances happened, including the larger ones that get us in and out of the full Ice Age conditions, and by knowing that, we have the power to protect ourselves against the changing conditions, as we will experience them again in the future. We have the power, for example, to build the needed infrastructures to protect our food supply when the deep Ice Age cooling begins again. And this may not be far off. The transition may have already begun. We certainly can't change the universe, interjected Mahja. But we can move with the universe. We know the truth that these cycles are happening, and that they will change the climate, as they have done so during the last several million years. By protecting ourselves in time, we develop the capacity to survive the next Ice Age cycles with our civilization remaining intact. That's the power of the truth. Our being able to know the truth is a gift from Allah. It defines what we are. We also don't know precisely what effect the coming Ice Age cooling will have on our global food production, Jamal interjected. We can assume, however, that the effect will likely be huge. A big global cooling, especially if it is made more severe by the declining trend in CO2 levels in geologic terms, could easily wipe out 90% of the present agriculture. Our global agriculture is based entirely on the current warm climatic conditions. If those conditions end, our food supply will end, unless we continue the warm climate in indoor facilities. The only condition that mankind has known for the last 10,000 years is the interglacial warmth that has enabled agriculture. No, our food is a gift from Allah, said Mahja. Agriculture is a product of the mind. It doesn't happen naturally. Sure, we have utilized the warm climate and created an amazingly powerful agriculture, but when the warm climate ends, our mind offers other options. It is possible, for example, for the tropics to be transformed from a jungle to become the breadbasket of the world, in an effort to recover some of the lost food-producing capacity that then happens in the colder regions. But will we do it? And even then, this too wouldn't ultimately be enough to feed 7 to 10 billion people as the cooling deepens. This means that human survival on this planet adds up to the need for making enormous technological preparation and upgrading our world in order to give us the capacity to put the present agriculture into indoor facilities, where it can be protected from the deep low temperatures to come. Indoors agriculture can never be so big as to feed the world, Astrid interrupted. I've seen the American grain belt stretching from Canada all the way to the deep south, in the USA. I have flown 4 hours over fields stretched out as wide as the horizon. I didn't say it would be a small effort, said Mahja. I said it is possible to do that. When the mind digs deeper into the truth, I expect yields to increase 30-fold, maybe 50-fold, when all the natural factors in plant growth are optimized and become applied to indoor agriculture. Right now, we don't even know what the most ideal growing conditions are, in terms of temperature, air composition, CO2 concentration, light intensity, light cycles, light color composition, moisture content in the air, the complexity of soil composition, or even the bacteriological composition in the soil, or soil temperature, soil moisture, and many other things. The fact is, we virtually don't know anything about real agriculture. The real agricultural revolution hasn't even begun. I would say, we are still walking in our baby shoes. We might get 10 or 20 harvests in a year for some crops, under optimized conditions. We might even supplement the botanical processes with bacteriological engineering to vastly increase the nutritious content of the foods that are grown, said Jamal, and began to laugh. We have stopped being progressive. We are going backwards in agriculture. Right now we drown our fields with fertilizers to increase the tonnage, while we kill the bacteriological processes in the soil that produce folic acid that is essential for making minerals soluble and useful by the plants for human digestion. Modern agriculture has made our foods nutritionally hollow. We've been racing backwards. We've become a starving society in a world that is rich with food production potentials. Optimized agriculture, based on scientific processes, can take us 50 steps ahead and produce highly nutritious foods that actually taste like they're supposed to taste. We might even be able to develop brand new crop species in the super optimized environments, which will likely be even more efficient. In a very real way, that kind of dramatic increase in humanist energy that I am talking about, by means of technology, can revolutionize the productive power of the botanical world beyond anything we have seen in the prehistoric periods, when steaming jungles supported hordes of gigantic voracious eating machines that we now stand in awe before in the museums. With advanced scientific engineering, we will be able to outproduce any of the biologically most productive periods in our planet's history. Certainly, we would outproduce our present puny efforts in outdoors agriculture, possibly as much as 10,000-fold per acre of land area, utilizing multi-story facilities. Technology then becomes our firewall that keeps the biological fire intensely burning when the Ice Age climate would quench the flame, added Mahja. But what is technology? Isn't it the product of the mind? Am I wrong then to say that it is the gift of Allah? Mankind has something that no other form of life on this planet has, or has demonstrated to have, which is our power to reason and to make creative discoveries that uplift our world. It's that simple in principle, said Jamal, and laughed. Technologically, it is totally possible for us to put all of the world's food production indoors. It may take 100 years of intense effort to do it, but it can be done. We may have to build agricultural development labs that are 50 times the size of an Olympic stadium to discover the optimized processes, but it can be done. So why haven't we started? I asked. The reason is that we haven't been able to tackle the biggest challenge yet, said Jamal. This involves transforming mankind from a universally divided and isolated society, mired in greed, hate, fear, indifference, fascism, and gross inhumanities, as we have them today, into a globally developing coherent society, empowered by the principle of universal love, The challenge to get there, from where we are today, is probably as huge as the challenge that Muhammad faced in the post-Roman period of utter barbarism. He faced the challenge to recreate a human society and a world in which people have a future. And he was highly successful in meeting this challenge. What he achieved towards this end created such a huge scientific renaissance in humanist terms that its echo uplifted Europe in its darkest hours. It created two major cycles of renaissance in Europe, which in turn gave rise to the USA as the beacon of hope and the bastion of liberty for mankind. While most of these long-term historic achievements have been destroyed again, said Mahja, the demonstrated principles behind the achievements remain. That is why Jamal and I are digging deep into our history, the history of Islam, and into what stood behind it, as a starting point for creating the biggest renaissance ever, in which the Ice Age will not even be an inconvenience when it begins. We truly have the capacity, as human beings, to cause this to happen, said Jamal. We also have the capacity to uplift ourselves to empower us to do this. That may add up to a huge challenge, considering the mess the world is in today. But so what? If Islam once met this type of challenge and created a whole new world, then we can do this again. We can do this, even though the challenge that Muhammad faced was minuscule in absolute terms in comparison with what must be accomplished presently, and in a very short time. I think we can do this again, because the process and the principles are the same as those that Muhammad had discovered and had utilized. Moja raised her hand and interrupted Jamal. We are facing nothing less than the challenge of turning a multiplied divided world with the deepest divisions that ever existed into a globally cooperative and mutually supportive world. That's like turning night into day. That means reversing all the deep divisions that are presently magnified and duplicated in countless ways, and in countless spheres of people's petty little self-interests, where total disregard rules for the survival of civilization and mankind as a whole. For getting ourselves out of this trap, we have to question everything that we believe in, for its validity in terms of validated scientific principles, said Mahja. Islam comes to light as a powerful foundation in this process. It may once again save mankind from its deepest abyss, and uplift it sufficiently high in its scientific self-discovery as human beings that an Ice Age renaissance may be created. If we achieve that, it will uplift mankind to such a degree of advancement that it may never collapse into its ancient trap of imperialism again. Do you have any idea what vast implications are intertwined with what you have just laid on the table? I said to Jamal. You just said that Islam is bound to be the final renaissance. No, that's not what I said Jamal. I merely suggested that Islam is our pathway out of religion, and out of imperialism and dogmatism, which are all the same in essence, and becomes a pathway to the higher scientific recognition of the truth. Of course, Islam itself will have to be rescued from the same trap. The name of Islam may indeed vanish in this process, while its Renaissance principles and its foundation in scientific and spiritual development will come to the foreground to be further developed, perhaps even without a specific name attached. Jamal paused at this point and smiled. Islam is science. He continued emphatically. There exists only one science. The science may have countless different expressions, but there is only one science possible, because there is only one truth. In Christianity, science has been given the name Christ. Muhammad has called it Islam. Science opens an approach to the truth, in which we discover ourselves as sublime human beings. Muhammad has put before humanity a concept of God that is universal principle, that is truth, life, love, and is our universal human soul. No one has presented a greater concept of God, apart from America's great spiritual pioneer of the 19th century, named Mary Baker Eddy. I see the religions trending towards an eventual merging at a universal perception of truth. Islam puts science forward as a progressive construct that uplifts mankind into the lateral universe of truth, where hierarchical concepts have no place, said Mahja. No one has yet superseded the advanced perceptions that flow from science. Muhammad pulled a lot of it together and spoke of one truth, which mankind is in the process of discovering in itself, reflected in its own being. He was saying in essence to mankind that when you see glimpses of truth, this is it, stand in awe before them, as I do. Muhammad called the discovered universal truth simply All, or Allah. The name, Allah, then represents the combined process of a profound scientific recognition, and of the inevitable law that comes with that recognition, in the four-man understanding of it. That brings together the all and the all. And that, I truly recognize, as a scientist, to be the inevitable outcome of human development. Muhammad was evidently a greater prophet than anyone in that respect, said Witzsche. He was probably the last in the line of the old prophets, since the absolute and its inevitable recognition by society cannot be superseded. We can only find ourselves standing side by side with it, I interjected. But is this really the universal perception of Islam today? Jamal shook his head. This is my own perception. This is the highest and truest perception of Islam that I can perceive. I am not a spokesman for other people and for what they perceive. Moja nodded at this point. The recognition that I see unfolding before me can only become clearer universally from this point forward, she said. It becomes clearer as we begin to discover what Muhammad has put on the plate of humanity. It doesn't really matter how far distant people place themselves from their universal truth, of which there is but one. In the progressive environment of science, regardless of the many names by which science is referred to, mankind will converge inevitably at the one truth, and find it embedded in our humanity, and reflected in our universal human soul. To me, Islam is the scientific extension of Christianity, said Jamal. Islam is Christianity's scientific name. There may be other names added in the future that give it a clearer identity. And someday, we will surely drop all the different names and call science for what it is, the gateway to the truth. I can also recognize that Islam is already unfolding towards that point with the continuing development of rigorous scientific structure in perceiving our humanity, moving towards the healing of mankind. While other names and other forms of science may emerge, and other processes of renaissance may unfold, they can only reflect what has already been recognized in essence as universal principle, unfolding presently as Allah. Allah means to me not just universal principle, and so forth, said Witzsche. Allah includes for me also our understanding and acknowledgement of universal principle recognized in universal science. I like to see science as a universal lateral concept that no human being is distant from. Ideally, this universal concept can have no name that would isolate it. Thus, for me, I find science included in the one name that represents all names, which is not really a name, but is simply Allah, a process of touching the truth. In this process we can all stand in awe before our humanity, and one another, and the principles we represent. Maybe that is what loving is, I interjected. Through universal science our understanding and acknowledgement of universal principle brightens our life as nothing else can. Thus we stand in awe before the truth that we represent in our recognition of the boundless nature of our universe and ourselves as human beings. Do you really believe all of that? Said Astrid to me. I do believe that, said Jamal, in my stead. It all fits together and makes sense, doesn't it? Muhammad has put that kind of scientific perception on the table, and had created a new civilization on this foundation to start the process, but he didn't close the door to its infinite unfolding. I nodded in agreement. It seems then that what Muhammad did was absolutely necessary in his time, in order to rescue humanity from the great civilizational crisis, I interjected. Astrid suggested that it was a beginning, with an open door to science and progress. What else would prevent the tragedy from being repeated in our world, of the kind that Rome had once dragged humanity into? You don't know how right you are, said Jamal. Muhammad was born 100 years after the fall of the Roman Empire that had destroyed civilization so deeply that there was no respect left for the human being, and much less for women. Under Roman rule, Greece, the cultural pearl of the Old World, had been so severely trashed that its population had been reduced in numbers to 15% of what it had been before Greece became Romanized. Other areas suffered similar losses. But the madness didn't stop when Rome collapsed. The degrading momentum continued, so that conditions became still worse. With that, the Dark Ages began that dragged on for almost 1,000 years in Europe. The Dark Ages might never have ended had the Islamic Renaissance not been created by Muhammad, which many centuries later provided the cultural foundation for the Golden Renaissance in Europe, at a time when the Dark Age collapse was at its worst there. The brightness of the Islamic Renaissance had pulled Europe out of its darkest mess. It brought Plato back into Europe, and with it a scientific foundation for a new Christianity. That became the Golden Renaissance. Muhammad did the same in the Arab world. Except he began it from a standing start, said Witzsche. He had nothing to fall back to except what was rooted in his own nature as a human being, coming to light in a process of scientific discovery. In real terms, he tapped into the reality of his being and all being. It appears that when the post-Roman mess had become intolerable, Muhammad became aware that a radical shift was absolutely necessary and was possible and inevitable. His trending towards this shift may have been ongoing in the background for many years, until it culminated into the profound discovery, when he was 40 years old, which changed the world. The principles that he discovered, and later laid down in the Quran, created a new civilization throughout much of the Old World. It became a civilization founded on Muhammad's Allah concept of the self-revealing principle and truth. Out of that emerged the Islamic Renaissance, a scientific renaissance. It created a new world and is still creating it. But Muhammad started it all. Muhammad grew up as an orphan, said Jamal. His life began at the bottom level in a harsh world. However, he became soon recognized as a man of great integrity. He became the trusted master of a caravan. Eventually he married the woman who owned the caravan, by which he became a businessman as well. He may have been driven by the need to build a richer civilization for his children, and for all children. He may have wanted to create a future worth living for. Being a resourceful man, he simply created it. It may have been his love for the children, in whom he saw his own humanity reflected, that may have impelled him to create a world in which they have a future, and in which his immortality as a human being was reflected and assured in concrete terms. It may likewise be our own love for our children, said Witzsche, that has the potential for becoming a renaissance force in the modern world. As we've seen in our children, our own humanity reflected, that will prompt us to upgrade our world so radically that the coming ice age will have no effect on them. It may be our love for our children, once again, that will save civilization and protect mankind. We face the need to achieve the greatest transformation in society that has ever occurred in human history, Jamal continued. Our need is to do this quickly. We need to complete a 100 years development cycle carried out throughout the world before the Ice Age starts. The start of the coming deep freeze may only be 150 years away, at the very most. Our love for our children may be the only impetus at this stage that empowers us to see the needed project through, to save mankind and civilization from a doom worse than anything we have seen before. If we were to fail at this final chance that we still have, the consequences would give fascism a benign face in comparison with what we might see when food begins to run out across the world. 9/10 of mankind will likely be doomed by the loss of global food production if we fail to upgrade our world by utilizing the physical resources that we still have today. I think we will do everything that is needed and more, said Witzsche. It is being said that Allah dictated the Quran to Muhammad. That is how the dawn of science developed that has itself no limits. This dictation, in which the Quran was received, is not possible in the literal sense, of course, since the kind of Allah that Muhammad recognized has no physical form or voice or gender, but unfolds as a voice in the mind. This is also the way in which Allah is unfolding to us today, to enable us to continue to uplift civilization with the resources of the limitless mind that unfolds in mankind. During the Islamic Renaissance, the forward-moving kind of scientific discovery process that Muhammad had started continued on. Now we are forced to move further still. In the olden days, Islam became the center for a broad range of scientific and spiritual development. The process continued for 800 years unabated. It still continues today to some degree, and may flare up again into an Ice Age Renaissance, breaking limits that we haven't even perceived yet. When Baghdad became the capital of the world in the early period of the scientific development of Islam, said Witzsche, the works of Plato and many other works of the Greek classical era were translated and kept alive. Apparently Plato's method for scientific discovery had a great influence on the Islamic Renaissance, and may yet again become the root of the continuing process of mankind's self-discovery, for a modern Ice Age Renaissance that I expect will unfold. The living Plato was the foundation that Islam brought to Europe, said Jamal. It happened at a time of Europe's greatest need during the twin crisis of its devastating financial collapse in 1345, and the Black Death plague that resulted from it 2 years later that wiped out half of the population of Europe. In the ever-deepening shadow of this horrendous crisis, Islam gave Europe a new start on living. A foundation for living as human beings. That is how Plato came back to Europe. On that foundation the Golden Renaissance emerged. It literally came out of Baghdad, and one never knows, Baghdad may yet become the cradle again for another new world, in this case for the soon-to-be emerging Ice Age Renaissance. Jamal turned to me and began to laugh. That historic development makes Mecca, Median, and Baghdad the cradle of the USA, and the cradle for our future. Did you know that? Without the Renaissance there would have been no USA, and without that, we might not have built up enough of a foundation to be able to build ourselves up further to meet the Ice Age requirements. We face a critical barrier against our survival when our agriculture won't be carried on in protected and enriched indoor environments, and this on a scale that no one can yet imagine. I hope you realize now what a huge potential we have as human beings, said Witzsche to Astrid, and how the world can change once we begin to develop that potential. We are spiritual beings on a journey through a material world. We are endowed with the power to transform this world, and to uplift it. That makes us unique. That gives the dynamics of human life a unique quality. The animal world doesn't have that unique power. Many animal species will become wiped out in the coming Ice Age, for the lack of protection, unless we protect them with our life-preserving technologies that we must build to save ourselves. You weren't aware of any of that, were you? A large arena of life depends for its survival on our technological potential for protecting life when the going gets rough. Astrid shook her head. Baghdad really was the scientific center of the world prior to the Renaissance in Europe, said Witzsche, looking at me. Baghdad still is the intellectual center for the Muslim world. Whoever is seeking a scientific education in the Muslim world will go to Baghdad. That's only natural, because science is our link to Allah, and Baghdad is the historic center of both. It is our link to a universal principle reflected in the human being and the universe. Unfortunately, a lot of the old tradition has become lost. Even hijab is fast disappearing, while its principle remains valid on a higher level. Are you sure that its principle remains valid? I said to Witzsche. Has its principle not been overlaid with the religious type of imperialism? For many a woman, Islam has become a trap. It begins with hijab that encourages a woman's self-isolation. It then prepares her for the still deeper isolation that follows in marriage, which is mandatory in Islam, where it then becomes her mandated role to perform the function of a sex slave and household servant. Her husband's happiness becomes her personal responsibility under the Islamic marriage doctrine. What I see happening here is miles distant from the ideal that you said Muhammad had represented when he said in essence that I, meaning Islam, trample on everything that divides human beings from one another. Look at your Christian world, said Jamal quietly in answering for Witzsche. You find the same regressing process happening in Christianity. That doesn't excuse anything, I replied in the same quiet tone. Islam presents itself as the scientific extension of Christianity. It should set its stage on higher ground. If Allah represents the acknowledgement of the profound universal principles of our humanity, which we truly stand in awe before, then hijab has to symbolize the freedom, dignity, and universal worth of the human being, rather than symbolizing a dead-end trap. Jamal hugged Mahja as if to protect her from a sudden attack. I have raised the question of hijab, said Astrid, because my friend from America appears to seek some sort of sexual contact with me. I see hijab as a warning to me not to go down this road, but to be happy just by being in love with myself. Jamal answered with a faint smile. Be careful with that. You may be heading in the wrong direction. Moja and I regard hijab as a spiritual platform. We respect hijab for that. We aim to uplift it onto a higher platform, whereby the moral principles that society finds difficult to deal with become raised up to ever greater conformity with what is real about our humanity. The Islamic Renaissance has been a renaissance of scientific progress. Right now, true scientific and spiritual progress is regarded the enemy of mankind. Every empire in history has been at war with mankind's love for scientific and spiritual progress. Islam has been especially targeted in that war. It has been given a harsh imperialistic and unyielding fundamentalist face. Moja and I, and a small circle of friends, are trying to restore the scientific renaissance potential of Islam. This means restoring hijab onto a platform of a beautiful spiritual principle by which it represents the opposite of self-isolation. The opposite of self-isolation? Tell me. What protects the fire from the water? Astrid interrupted, speaking to me as if she wanted to change the focus to justify her self-isolation. What protects the fire from the water? Moja repeated. She paused. You mean a special kind of firewall that keeps the water out and the fire in? She said moments later. You want a firewall that protects the fire. If you were equating the fire with passion for sex, the passion for being alive with a joy that radiates from experiencing the riches of our humanity, then I would say hijab is the answer that you seek. It protects the fire within. To me, hijab is that firewall that protects the fire of the passion for being alive from the floods that would drown it. As far as I am concerned, hijab fulfills that role. It truly is a gift from Allah, because without it that fire would be drowned for sure, as it largely has been drowned throughout the world by imperial cultural warfare. Just open your eyes and look around you. There is no passion left for being alive in people's life. I see lots of passion in the world for sex, Astrid interrupted Mahja. I think you are mistaken, said Mahja, and smiled. What you call passion is likely darkness. Too much of the fire has been drowned. There's no firewall left standing to protect it, which I can see. The firewall that protects the fire of living as a human being is love. How much of it do you see? I see greed, hate, rape, fascism, slavery, killing, exploitation, abuse, jealousy, and so on. The firewall is love, but I see a little of it. And without the firewall, without love being reflected, protecting the fire dies. It becomes quenched. Hijab is that firewall that will keep it from being quenched. Hijab is a symbol of universal love, the sun that I surround myself with, but not for self-isolation. Universal love. I repeated. Are you prepared to go as far as to say that this fire of passion for life, protected by universal love, includes also a passion for sex, even sex across the marriage boundary, which is an aspect of loving that Islam strictly forbids? I said to Mahja. Moja nodded. Islam forbids nothing, said Jamal to me in her stead. Islam enables. It does not disable. We ourselves do the disabling. As Mahja said, the determining factor in keeping the fire alive is love, nothing else. Love is the critical sphere. Sex outside the sphere of love is not passion for life. It is a dead thing that affords nothing, like a quenched fire affords neither warmth nor light. Outside the sphere of love, there is no fire possible. Such a fire that would be started there is instantly quenched. Nothing is protected there. It doesn't matter therefore under what umbrella sex happens, within or without marriage. The determining factor isn't marriage. The determining factor is love. And the determining factor for being in love is the great Renaissance principle, the principle of the advantage of the other. This principle comes to light at the sublime level of our self-discovery, the discovery of our humanity. It is linked to the principle of the universal marriage of mankind as human beings. In that universal marriage the fire is protected because the nature of universal love is sublime, whereby the fire is unquenchable. At the lower levels the fire is at risk, with or without marriage in the small domain. If the fire is quenched, regardless under which umbrella this happens, the sexual scene is dead. Pornography represents a quenched fire, with or without marriage, and so does sex, that has become drowned with lust, and countless forms of rape or rage are emptiness. Hijab protects us from all of that. Hijab keeps the fire alive and burning brightly by keeping it in the sublime domain protected by love, and by us keeping our focus on the principle of the advantage of the other. In this dimension sex is intimacy, an intimacy that nourishes the bonds that love has forged. The dawning intimacy then becomes reflected in ever wider spheres of intimacy, socially, nationally, economically, culturally, and so on. We need to have many such protected fires burning in the modern world in order to radically develop the passion for life around the globe that empowers us to create an Ice Age Renaissance, said Witzsche. We need that fire in order that our living will not fizz out into nothing for the lack of food resulting from a lack of focus on universal love. Right now, I can't see no fires lighting up the horizon. I see a scene that is so dead that an Ice Age Renaissance appears totally impossible. I see no passion left for life anywhere, with a few exceptions. The whole world appears to have been drowned in greed, hate, envy, pitiful smallness, or appears to be asleep in dreams of mythologies, where nothing is real. There are no fires in abundance that can power the kind of vast Renaissance development that puts agriculture indoors and protects it in a nuclear fusion-powered world, bright with material abundance, so that the Ice Age can cause us no harm. If the fires of passion for life, and for its reflection in our humanity, remain drowned out, said Witzsche, the 9/10 of mankind is doomed to die when the Ice Age begins. Without love as principle, which keeps the fire of passion for life burning, mankind is doomed. But this development has to start now. Without hijab there won't be an Ice Age Renaissance possible. Without love instilling a passion for life that comes to light as a profound loving for our children, nothing would empower us to create the Ice Age Renaissance in which that loving will continue to burn brightly and be maintained forever. The critical question isn't in which arena the passion for life and its reflection in our humanity unfolds, whether it be within or without marriage. The decisive factor of the question is that it does unfold, and that it keeps burning brightly in countless different ways, so that the process kindles many more fires everywhere. Astrid seemed astonished. If you say that, then you say that we have no hope, she said to Witzsche. You suggested that the fire has already been quenched all around the world. It appears to have been quenched in all areas but one, said Witzsche, and I think this one factor will pull us through and turn the tide in the world. This factor, as I already said, is our loving for our children. Without that loving we would say, who cares what happens in 100 years from now? Who cares what happens to future generations? Let them freeze and starve to death. I hear no one saying this, because whether we are conscious of it or not, we have a vested interest in the survival of our children, and in the long-term survival of mankind. I think this happens because we see in our children an echo of ourselves, of our own humanity reflected. Our careless allowing for this to be blown away with the wind is paramount to self-denial. Therefore, we keep the fire of our humanity alive with a passion, which in this case is a passion for our immortality. Our passion for immortality, reflected in our loving for our children, may be the greatest asset we have for protecting civilization and the existence of mankind. That is why I am certain that we will create the Ice Age Renaissance, and it will be powered by all kinds of fires of passion that will be lit along the way, enabled by scientific development. All these fires will be lit because science forbids nothing that is rooted in the truth and enables its unfolding. To me, Islam means science, and as Mahdi has already said, science forbids nothing that is rooted in the truth that is reflected in our humanity, said Jamal. In fact, the universal principles that we discover in science cause one to move in a certain direction, like discovering great beauty, strength, value, power, and peace, rooted in the heart of every human being. Moving in this direction becomes a devotion to an active principle that closes the door to us moving in the opposite direction, where the fire becomes drowned. Obviously, one cannot move into two opposite directions at the same time. If scientific and spiritual progress move together and cause one to discover more and more of the value and the beauty of the human being, then in the fire of passion for human life, all the inhuman pursuits, like killing, stealing, creating poverty, hate, envy, etc., become impossible. If we look at hijab, the Islamic scarf of a woman from this standpoint, said Mahdi, then hijab no longer represents the closed door of self-isolation and the subsequent institutional marriage isolation that is presently unfolding in general practice. Instead, hijab represents to us a commitment to close the door to everything that lies in the opposite direction from what the universal law is, which Allah represents, and is manifest in the fire of the passion for life that puts us in awe before what love protects and enables to be. That spiritual hijab thus closes the door fully to what dishonors the human being and what is degrading, oppressive, and enslaving, or things much worse like violence, rage, rape, injury, even murder. It also closes the door to the soft things that dishonor, such as jealousy, envy, neglect, disloyalty, and so forth. But it never closes the door to what we are as human beings and to our joy of being alive, including to what we are developing in the fire of our humanity, including sex. And so, the fire of sexual passion is good, as it draws us together universally, if we allow it to be, and then protect it with love. I suppose that is true, said Astrid. However, the same water that drowns the fire also nourishes all life. Yes, but the water needs to stand side by side with the fire, and not drown it, said Jamal. Love needs to be the firewall, the protector of both the fire of passion and the water that satisfies. Moja hugged Jamal as she said this. The bottom line is that we both regard hijab as a commitment to honoring one another and all human beings to such a degree that we stand before the principle of universal love with the same awe as we stand before Allah. If we do this, I see no reason why this active honoring should not extend beyond the marriage space and embrace humanity universally. Shouldn't the sphere where love rules be expanded to encircle all human beings? Shouldn't the fire which love protects put us in awe of life and all that is living? As the phrase, all, in Allah, implies. If this active honoring includes honoring one another as sexual human beings, which we are, then sexual contacts will naturally be included in the fire of life, or else we become hypocrites. Intimacy, being sought in self-isolation, is really not possible, is it? And so, honoring one another actively as sexual beings must be included as a demand on us in order to assure that nothing enters this sensitive arena that is in any way degrading and might in the slightest manner mar or belittle the face of the human being as the reflected face of the Supreme Being in the universe. Behind the closed bedroom door of the conventional world, the demand for this kind of sensitivity does not exist, said Jamal. With the bedroom door open, however, it becomes a paramount necessity that we demand the utmost of honesty with ourselves, never to violate our highest perception of the human being in any way or form. This higher-level demand for the utmost insensitivity tends to upgrade the whole sexual scene everywhere. It tends to remove all the elements that are not honestly justifiable between human beings and serve the advantage of the other. He turned to Mahja. Our personal experience has been, of Mahja and I, that the focus of the fire becomes increasingly shifted away from the physical sexual domain into the mental and spiritual domain that may on occasions have a physical component to some degree. On this path, our relationship towards one another as human beings can never again drop down to the level where people allow an orgy of lust, rape, or other forms of exploitation to happen, said Jamal. It simply won't be possible, because what one finds in that low-level sewer simply doesn't measure up to what can be attained at the higher level, where sex is not dirty, but comes to light as something gently human and beautiful. That's like leaving the ox cart behind in the pages of history for the automobile. Of course, there are huge challenges involved in getting to this point. To Mahja and I, hijab represents a commitment to master the challenges. It also reminds us of the unproductive road that we leave behind and the tragedy that pervades the entire imperial world in all its aspects, that darkens civilization with countless forms of its old world traditions of domination. Almost all of the world's religions spin a web around sex to regulate it and to regulate society with it, said Mahja. In Judaism, the great tribal religion that goes back in time to the biblical sons of Jacob, sex is kept forcefully within the marriage boundary. However, within this boundary, the unconditional availability of sex is guaranteed under the weight of law. The law of Judaism attributes the highest degree of respect for woman that we have seen throughout the ages. It gives a woman the right to hold property and to conduct business. However, under that law, a husband is required to provide sex, as requested by his woman, almost on demand. By this kind of compromise, the human need is met to some degree, almost ideally so it seems. However, this demanded fulfillment comes without any guarantee that a fire of passion for life will be lit in us and that it will light the sky out of the riches of our humanity. To the contrary, any forced setting like that isn't natural, comes at the horrendous cost of universal isolation and subjection to ritualized regulations. My point is that we are human beings and don't have to stop at a compromise stage if we can step up to higher ground and move beyond it and take sex up with us to this higher ground. Basic psychology tells us that sex and loving are essentially the same thing. But on the higher level, love gives a higher, harmonizing meaning to sex, which in turn enriches the dimensions of the bonds of our loving. This mutually uplifting process is much more demanding. Of course, its vastly greater challenge appears to be acknowledged in Buddhism, where the focus is no longer on barriers, but on compassion, opening the gates to love becoming reflected in our living. Judaism also contains a faint element of compassion, as it counsels that sex should only be experienced in times of joy. However, I see us going still farther with that by combining sex, joy, and love, and uplifting all three to the level of universal principle. Shouldn't this achievement be the greatest guarantor for the rights of any human being? Wouldn't it cause each human being, men and women alike, to be cherished in its fullest universality, acknowledging mankind as the brightest stars in the universe that we stand in awe before? We find in Hinduism some daring attempts to raise sex to a higher level, said Mahja. We find some attempts there to acknowledge that sex is one of the most deeply rooted elements in the human experience and is a greater factor in the development of civilization than it would be as but a pleasurable experience. Some attempts had been made to give it a spiritual dimension that I find inspiring, though it is inadequate. There is still too much spiritually lacking. For instance, in Hindu the human body is seen as a temple. In the Upanishads an attempt is made to uplift sex into its more precious dimension that is native to it. A verse from the Upanishads comes to mind that I clearly remember. It says about woman: her lap is the sacrificial altar, her hair the sacrificial grass, her skin within the organ-lighted fire. Her two labia of the vulva are the two stones of the soma. He who, knowing all this, practices sexual intercourse, assuredly wins as great a world as would be won through the Vihapaya sacrifice. The verse sounds like veiled pornography to me, I interjected. The truly spiritual and holy cannot be wrapped up into the small dimension of sex, where sex is the exciting cause. As I see it, the verse from the Upanishads is an insult to sex, and to women and men. The fire has to be nourished by love, and be protected by it. Love has to be the exciting cause, not sex. The Renaissance principle of the advantage of the other has to power the process. The verse doesn't even hint at this vital factor. If this factor is omitted, there is nothing there that is alive and uplifts people's existence, and the status of civilization remains at a low level. We need a sexual renaissance on the sublime terms that take us miles into the opposite direction from what the Upanishads have idealized. The verse in the Upanishads is meant to open the gates of exploitation, and make the exploitation of women a holy act. What it describes is another form of self-isolation, an intimacy, where the intention is missing to uplift one another. There is no intimacy possible in self-isolation. I looked at Astrid. I think this is what I sense is missing in your pursuit. Jamal nods. Sex can't have been intended to be pursued as a game, even a religiously regulated game, such as authorized sex. If it doesn't unfold in the fire of life that uplifts civilization, as it unfolds in bonds of love, it profits us nothing for advancing the progressive development of the human experience, where living unfolds for a purpose that goes beyond merely meeting the human need. Life should be a celebration, carried by joy. Sex should have a part in that celebration of life that uplifts everything to where love and its manifest in joy become combined and set the stage for universal happiness. Sex most certainly not a sacrificial altar. The verse from the Upanishads defines a woman as a sex slave, doesn't it? Moja just laughed. Did you expect the Upanishads to uplift the human dimension? Look at the historic cultural quagmire that the Upanishads became a part of, in which the human scene was ruled by imperial brutality and exploitation for 3,000 years. What goes for spiritual value all too often idealizes imperial processes designed for subjugation, or self-subjugation, where lust, domination, rape, injury, neglect, and exploitation rule, said Mahja. Unfortunately, what the Upanishads describe in the verse that I remember reflects very much the scene of our present world, where the fire of love, the principle of the advantage of the other, has been quenched by the waters that have become greed and lust and power. Hijab shields us from that. Only the imperatives of active universal principles can get us to this higher stage, where all those lower aspects fall away and sex becomes transformed from being a sacrificial altar on which humanity is sacrificed in holy isolation and the deepest division that has yet been created. My hijab isn't for self-isolation. It's the firewall that protects what is precious. This is the reason why it is of a golden color. It is an enabling impetus of all that is good and enriching. In this case you have discovered the reason why America is economically and culturally disintegrating, I interjected. Nothing is protected in my home country anymore. Protection is considered a bad word. Rape is rampant. The masters of empire are looting our country. It is laid bare, to be destroyed. Maybe we should forge a golden hijab for our country, for its protection, and thereby enable its development. You already have what you seek, said Jamal. Your problem is that you don't wear your golden hijab. It is called the American Constitution. It is a golden constitution, an enabling constitution. Beneath my golden hijab I celebrate sex as a beautiful human dimension in an atmosphere of joy that reflects sex as a valuable part of our humanity that all experience tells us is designed to unite us and bring us closer to one another, even to where we are standing side by side as spiritual beings, said Mahja. Most of the world takes only a small step in that direction with a smile and a hug which says I love you. And if people are really lucky they manage a kiss across the boundaries that isolate them, I said to Astrid. The rest of the people just dream about what they might have, Because without the enabling Renaissance principle, the principle of the advantage of the other, society lacks the love that lights the fire of life and builds the firewall that keeps the waters out. And so, where is the fire? Whatever fire there is, dies. The kisses become rare, and the hugs a faint expression of what might have been had we built a richer world for ourselves. In the narrowed-down world that passes for Hinduism today, we find only a spark towards this end, if that, Jamal agreed. Hinduism is said to be a way of life that focuses on tolerance. Unfortunately, this tolerance has been terribly abused for countless centuries, under the yoke of a destructive mythology that trends away from universal principles towards autocratic imperial rule and arbitrary dogmas that once opened the floodgates of the worst inhumanities imaginable. The Hindu religion has been hijacked in distant times and has been destroyed, but it appears to have had rich color in the beginning, before the abuses were imposed. I raised my hand to interrupt Jamal. You are saying that today's Hinduism is the total opposite of your Allah recognition, where we stand in awe before the majesty of the universal principle that is the harmonizing power of the universe itself. My friend Steve calls the spirit of it love. It appears that Hinduism has been perverted to where it mothers what would normally be reflected in our humanity and in the unfolding profundity of the human experience, said Jamal. Hinduism has become a tool, intentionally created for the imperial conquest and domination, designed to subjugate society beginning with the Aryan invasion of India, around 1500 BC. Its perversion has cut deep into the human heart for over 3 millennia, casting a shadow so long that it may have blanketed the human soul around the world. A great deal of healing is evidently needed to remove that blanket. Now the Ice Age is forcing us to get on with the long overdue healing. For this we need to develop the principle of universal love, and everything that goes with it. The capacity to do this is our gift from Allah. It turns isolation into an intimate embrace. It makes the healing achievable. And so, if the healing happens, it makes the coming Ice Age transition a non-event, whenever it happens. As I said before, the path to building an Ice Age renaissance is not an impossible one. Its road is clear. It is a beautiful road, straight and easy, leading to an ever-richer world. Moja nodded to me. You should have signed up for the Love Beyond Religion workshop, she said to me. Actually, the workshop should have been called The Incredible Human Experience. One of the moderators spoke about the process of combining sex and loving as a mutually enriching process, in which both aspects become greater, and the end result becomes greater even than both aspects combined. Moja told us about the workshop. She compared the process of combining sex and loving into joy, and said it is similar to the process of tending a garden that has been neglected, which becomes an unending process of pulling out weeds that shouldn't have rooted there, and of planting roses in their stead. She pointed out that it isn't enough to pull out the weeds, which would leave the garden bare. She added that there are many such weeds on the sexual scene. Pulling out weeds alone does not make a garden great. She told us that one needs to replace them with beautiful things that one wishes to grow up with in life. She looked at Jamal and said that the human garden becomes richer in beauty by this kind of process, as new colors are added. She told us that the human garden will then soon explode with a profusion of colors and joy, all created with endless devotion and a great care to bring to light the beauty of our divine soul, as all gardens invariably do. She pointed out to us that there are 16 kinds of flowers in the garden of the Taj Mahal. She said that each represents a facet of the color, the beauty, and the fragrance of love. She also said that the 16 kinds of flowers do not represent a limit in human unfolding, but rather represent infinity. She told us that the factor 4 is prominently represented in the design of the Taj Mahal, and she added that in her perception the 4 elements are loving, sex, joy, and beauty. She said that these 4 elements are deeply rooted in the fabric of our passionate humanity, where they are all needed and need to be cultured and be cultured together again and again, by which the incredible human experience truly becomes as incredible as it has the potential to be. I interrupted her, suggesting that she forgot marriage, economics, science, peace, truth, even Allah, as essential elements in the fabric of our humanity. She just grinned. They are included, she said, and it becomes your task to figure out how. In real life they are all intertwined, and many aspects have different meanings in different contexts. That makes our scientific self-development as human beings such a wonderful adventure. This might also be the reason why the garden of the Taj Mahal is not a closed garden, said Jamal. The garden is made up of 4 groups of 4 squares, each with 4 different flowers. Thus, the factor of 4 is multiply interwoven and represented at different levels, one of which may represent the absolute, that we don't know yet, but which we are in the process of discovering. If that stands behind the design of the Taj Mahal is designed to enrich mankind in its scientific dimension, which is really a spiritual dimension, and it is this dimension which satisfies. I think this is the water that love also protects. At the Taj the 2 are combined. People from all over the world come there, and, as they do, they bring the riches of their love into it as they stand in awe before the splendor of it in its garden, above which it rises as the greatest temple to love ever built. Just look at it. The very shape of the Taj Mahal is the shape of love. It is a monument to beauty, care, and sublimity. It inspires loving and represents it, and so it enriches our world. Perhaps it is meant to inspire us in this manner, as it reflects the sublime qualities of our universal humanity in all aspects. Because without loving, sex, joy, and beauty, all coming together in an ever higher form, as a rich presence in our hearts, our civilization is doomed to collapse and vanish. We seem to be told there, in the garden of the Taj, that these sublime elements need to be cultured and come together as a sun that brightens the universe with our humanity. And that, I think, is what civilization is all about. It is a brilliant star in the universe created out of the treasures of a sublime humanity. Without the sun that we culture within, we cannot survive, interjected Astrid, with a smile that was like a sun itself. The forces that would unfold without it would destroy us, as history has amply shown in the tragedies of the dark times, when the sunshine is blotted out and the fire quenched. This has been my experience. But why can't I be a sun to myself, and let it be with that? What the Taj might have been built to represent might yet save us from further tragedies, said Mahja. Then she blushed, and continued in a more hushed voice. One participant in the workshop said during one of the many discussion periods that the shape of the dome of the Taj Mahal gives the structure an intensely feminine feel to it. The woman said that the gently swelling form of the great dome was not only unique in architecture, as it was probably difficult to build, but that it also affected her in a powerful sexual kind of way, as if it were intentionally erotic by design. This woman's comment caused quite a few protests, said Mahja, but she defended herself. She told the class that since the Taj is widely regarded as a timeless monument to the grace of Indian womanhood, why then shouldn't it reflect elements of feminine sexuality? And indeed, why shouldn't it reflect that for any reason? The Taj is more than that, said Jamal. The Taj Mahal as a whole contains altogether 16 domes shaped like a woman's breast, complete with an areola on top, standing side by side with an array of 16 male symbols like the 4 minaret-type towers that form the 4 corners of the temple complex. In the structure of the Taj, the male and the female are drawn together, and in the garden of the Taj we find the vulva represented that symbolizes the bonds of intimacy. That's a nice fairy tale, said Astrid. Oh, is it? Said Mahja. Sex is an element that unites us across all borders, status, greed, and wealth, across all cultures, all religions, and all nationalities. It is valued by kings and beggars alike, by noblemen and slaves, by priests and congregations, and by people of all vocations and colors, on all the continents on earth. The fairy tale about the Taj is that it was built by the great Shah Jahan for his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, his most beloved, who had borne him 14 children, and then died at childbirth, said Jamal. That's the fairy tale the world treasures, but it wasn't like that. Her name is never even mentioned in the court records where countless lesser escapades of the Shah carefully noted. Political expediency often modifies history, and in the service of it, a tragic love story is tied to the Taj, a story that ends in death so that it plays on the harp strings as required for the cover-up. In that sense, the Taj Mahal is also a monument to folly, with sex being abused in it, I interjected. Sex has always been an extremely difficult subject for society to deal with, said Jamal. That is why so many attempts have been made to bottle it up, to contain it, to hide it, to privatize it, to demonize it, to regulate it, and if it is expedient, to dredge it up for political objectives, or to abuse it for such objectives. Almost all religions try to regulate it, and divide it, and isolate society in the flow of it. In Islam, the burqa and hijab have offered a retreat from this flow, except here too, perversion has led to a passive response, which became isolation rather than a response impelled by an active principle that empowered the freedom of movement of an individual with complete security. I have been told that many women value the privacy the burqa affords, but I can't help feel sad for the women, as this approach leads to an empty peace, not the rich peace of an intimate unity that flows with the principle of the advantage of the other. Nevertheless, in spite of all these countless hurdles that have been created against the intimacy of sex, sex has always drawn people together, even across the severest boundaries built by myths, traditions, emotions, guilt, fear, penalties, even the death penalty. The longing for an empty peace and isolation appears inconsistent with this kind of universal response. It doesn't solve the problem. It evades the problem. I think Muhammad would be horrified to see a woman isolated behind the burqa, and even more so to discover the pitiful small-minded thinking that still divides and isolates the whole of mankind from one another after all those years. I think he would take the best we have been able to achieve with what he started, such as the principle of the advantage of the other, and add another section to the Quran to explain it. Most likely those verses would contain words that empower the kind of response in people in which sex unfolds as an element of our humanity that unites us as human beings rather than isolates us. He would likely tell us that we are hypocrites, because we do respond to this principle only secretly, as best as we can, because the principle itself isn't understood. Of course, as an uniting element, sex goes against the grain of nearly all religions. The religions all oppose what would erode the hierarchical model on which every religious institution rests. Thus, the priestly trend remains today what it always has been, an urgency to squash whatever unites mankind, if need be with death penalties, or, as in the case of the Brahmin Hinduism, with female genocide and holy prostitution. Holy prostitution? Astrid interjected questioningly. The Devadasis prostitution in India, answered Jamal. The Devadasis were temple servants originally to do the cleaning, teaching, dancing, and so forth. There was never any official temple prostitution, of course. Prostitution was always organized for financial gain, usually by the rich. All too often the destitute temple servants became dragged into the trade, by which the trade was given a noble cover, and the victim a horribly degrading stigma. This tends to be the trend in a hierarchical exploitative society. In this sense I see no paradox between female genocide and holy prostitution. They're but different facets of the same thing. The same sort of thing happens with sex in society generally. People want sex, they go to great lengths to get it, but they speak ill of the people that are abused and dragged into this empty process. Terrible names are given to women that become victimized. It appears to me that the further society moves away from the principle of the advantage of the other, the darker becomes the trap that it drifts into. It seems that by trashing sex that way, society defames an element of itself, rather than raising its perception of it as a deeply uniting human element. Our fascination with sex, if allowed to stand on its own and far apart from these abuses, would stand at the same level as loving. Wouldn't it? Said Mahja. it would stand at the same level as our ability to create, our appreciation of beauty, and our capacity to discover principles and aspects of truth. Universal sex, if honestly pursued, as we acknowledge our universal humanity, becomes an impetus for sensitivity, honor, respect, reverence, loving, and other such spiritual qualities, the kind that unfold into a renaissance within, that uplifts all the other aspects as well. How else can we begin to overturn the universal division and self-isolation of mankind that stand in the way of building the Ice Age Renaissance, by which the existence of civilization and mankind hang in a balance? Maybe our love for our children, who will someday depend on this renaissance for their very life, will impel us to resolve our petty divisions and our empty forms of self-isolation, I interjected. We embrace sex with loving and with a sense of beauty, said Mahja, and we let it unfold with such joy that we become infinitely sensitive not to let an iota of it drop to the ground and be trampled underfoot. It becomes for us an impetus, among many others, to discover ourselves to be human, as the most capable and creative species of life in the universe. Moja turned to Astrid while she was still speaking and pointed a finger at her. You shouldn't shy away from that, she said. If a possibility exists to experience our universal humanity that incorporates so much beauty, so many aspects of loving, so many reasons for joy, and above all is rich with those wonders of sex that defy all divisions we have imposed against it. Rather than trashing it, let us develop it and allow it to unite us with the fire of our human soul. Astrid shook her head slightly. Why would you want to isolate yourself from that? Said Jamal to Astrid. There is nothing in self-isolation and self-denial that is elevating our human experience. While self-isolation is deemed moral, it is a poor state. At best, it is but the minimal starting point on the road to higher ground, where we touch the hem of progressive development. Self-isolation is putting us all to sleep. That is why it has been cultured for centuries. It nurtures self-denial. It flows from the imperial game that robs people of their divine soul, that defines their humanity. It opens the horizon for the imposition of fascism. When Astrid stopped shaking her head, Jamal continued. Let me tell you an apparently true historic account of scientific spiritual development, said Jamal to Astrid quietly. Without waiting for an answer, he began relating the story. A respected holy person of Islam appears in Mecca and intends to issue the public call for prayer. He intends to do it in such a profound way that people would never forget it. In order to accomplish this, he intertwines the call to prayer with a simple demand on people that requires them to reach for the sublime in a manner that the light of the divine soul enriches everyone's heart. Jamal stopped and looked at Astrid. What would you do if you were that holy person, determined to raise everybody's perception of our universal humanity to a higher level? Astrid shook her head again. Let me tell you what the holy man did, Jamal continued. In order to accomplish his objective, the holy man selects a black person, who is also a slave. He asks him to announce the official call to prayer. Now, as if this were not enough of a shock for a snobbish religious society, that a black man, who is also a slave, should call them to prayer, the holy man instructs the black slave to make that call to prayer while standing on the roof of the Kaaba in Mecca, right on top of the most holy shrine in all of Islam. And that is what appears to have really happened. As expected, a lot of people were horrified that a black slave would stand on top of the most holy shrine of Islam and defile it, and defile the call to prayer as well. To counter their response, the holy man stood before them all and recited a new verse that he later added to the Quran. That verse raised the universal dignity of the human being to a higher level than it had ever been raised before. After everyone had listened to the new verse and heard the message, the black man, who was also a slave, was then honored by the people as one of their own. With this single act, the whole of humanity became redefined and became honored as sisters and brothers, said Jamal. In this manner, a new world had been created for them that never existed before. In this new world, no one was isolated. All were standing side by side with no distance between them. Now, at last, the holy man was satisfied that the prayer could begin, because the platform on which one could now stand before Allah with awe and joy had been established. The people had something profound to acknowledge in their prayer, both about themselves and about their raised perception of humanity. Here Astrid's face lit up with a smile. Now I know what I would have done, and what should still be done today. I would have done everything the same, except I would have a woman stand on top of the Kaaba, without a burqa, without a veil, and without those dresses that cover her totally to the tip of her toes. Nor would she be dressed in a bikini, but in a manner that extends her beauty, as a woman, that she is, like any woman would. Burying the burqa would revolutionize Islam, and might also revolutionize the way sex is perceived throughout the world, said Jamal. Maybe that is what we need, something that can cause the liberation of men, he added, and grinned. Someday we may lose our sexual isolation in that way, added Mahja. In fact, we will lose all isolation against one another once this process begins, as we master our freedom from the sexual isolation, that is the most powerful form of isolation right now. This is inevitable, of course. Muhammad prophesied this kind of advance of freedom in embracing the reality of our being as a dual spiritual species. He prophesied that the principle of universal love would bridge all isolation by its own power, politically, religiously, economically, and sexually. He said that he tramples underfoot everything that divides mankind from one another. That's an expression of the principle of universal love. This is how an act of peace is won in the world, added Mahja. I would say that you should move with this process as far as this becomes possible, said Jamal to Astrid. This, my dear sister, is the path we try to follow, Mahja and I. It has been a rich path so far. It is our path towards becoming sensitive to the great principles of the universe. That's the Allah process. It is not a process of self-enslavement to anything, but a process of embracing all the principles of the universe, and of our humanity, and of our standing in awe before them. And that is the natural outcome of touching the truth. If you open your door to Allah, in this way, along the path of scientific progress, you begin to enter the world of Islam, which to me means science. You enter a new world of infinite dimensions, the world that you may have never known to exist, the world in which barriers fall away, the world of kindness, of humanity with humility, the world of joy-bound happiness, of piety and wonder, as we discover ever more of the reality of our being. And hijab symbolizes all that? I interjected. I wear it proudly, as a gift from Allah, answered Mahja, because for me it symbolizes no longer a commitment to limits and isolation. It symbolizes to me a commitment to the truth, to the boundless wonders of our humanity, that we begin to discover with the principle of the advantage of the other. That's what I want to surround myself with, and proudly, so that is why I wear hijab. Hijab represents light. That is what hijab symbolizes for me. I see myself in it, as being clothed with the sun. That is why my hijab is golden in color. It has been my experience that people who see me in this fashion will not shy away, but join me in the light of the golden hijab. It symbolizes my own golden renaissance, as it were. In its light there is no distance remaining between anyone and us, and at times intimately so. That is why I say that hijab is a gift from Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, that gives us in our days what we most hope for, and stills our needs before we even recognize them, and brings a healing that unfolds as a non-event. My response to what Mahja had said was one of awe, indeed. I found myself bowing to her, and to Jamal. Or was I bowing to Allah? I also bowed to Astrid, who seemed to have glimpsed something of the great profundity that we had touched upon, and had made a rule for herself not to loosen her hijab until its gold had been made precious enough to become a sun, with which she might uplift the world and brighten civilization. I told Astrid, after we had said goodbye to Mahja and Jamal, as we were leaving the coffee shop, that I had already experienced the kind of intimate encounter that Mahja had hinted at as being possible and natural. I know you have, she said, and smiled. I shook my head and told her that the encounter I meant had happened in East Germany, and that I hadn't understood much of it at the time, except for one aspect, which I understood deeply. I had been fully aware at this time that nothing must be allowed to enter the intimacy that was unfolding, which would mar or cheapen even the slightest aspect of it. I had determined that only that would be allowed which would enrich one another, so that there would be light and joy in abundance instead of tensions and darkness. I also told Astrid that I faced a much greater challenge now in retrospect. I said that I faced the challenge to find a way to invite my wife to meet me in the sunshine of that new world. I explained to Astrid that I had welcomed the assignment to come to Russia, hoping that it might serve me as a sanctuary where I might figure things out, while instead the challenge became larger. I told Astrid that the scene became constantly wider, while the door to the old world that was left behind moved ever farther out of sight. I also told Astrid that I was gradually beginning to understand what the Venetian oligarchy must have recognized when the Golden Renaissance overshadowed their existence. The Renaissance was sweeping across Europe at the time with such a force that the Venetians must have seen the door to their old imperial way of life, and with it the door to their empire, receding far into the distance. They couldn't allow this Renaissance to go too far. The prospect of the old world fading into oblivion had threatened to cut them off from their oligarchic way of life that had sustained them from the day their empire was built. They acted swiftly, therefore, and took hold of the door to the old world and reopened it. They destroyed the Renaissance by committing themselves to their old world, and by the same token they started a war against every other Renaissance that ever came along. That is why I must never reopen my own door to the old world, I said to Astrid, but must find a way to bring my wife into the new world with me, where there is brightness and peace. We all must do this, said Astrid quietly. We must become so successful in this that no one is ever tempted to reopen the door to the old world again when a new Renaissance begins to unfold, like the new Islamic Renaissance that our friends from Baghdad appear to be determined to work for. This means that we are in a race now. The race is on to create the new and profoundly human environment in the world that protects Baghdad from becoming crushed in the coming drive to prevent the new Renaissance from erupting again. The new drive to crush even the faintest spark of the spirit of Renaissance flows from the old center of empire that dehumanizes culture for its despicable end. The old Venetian empire is on the march again, so it seems, I replied with a smile of agreement. Russia, America, China, and India are all in need of a new Renaissance, I added, speaking more quietly and seriously now. If a new Renaissance in Russia doesn't happen, the Soviet Union may collapse, and America will follow in the same track, and China and India will collapse as a consequence. The present Soviet world is empty and scary. It is blackened with the Ogorkov plan for nuclear war, by which the Soviet Union is doomed. However, when the giant falls, which the Soviet Union is, nothing will remain the same in the world. The whole world will be transformed, and it won't be for the better. The process of collapse into chaos doesn't bring society any closer to responding to universal principles. Chaos doesn't cause development. Nothing will change, even in chaos, unless a renaissance can be created that links society back to its highest previous achievements. Except, this will likely be prevented too, this time around. Baghdad will fall in the whirlwind behind the collapse of the Soviet Union, because Baghdad too has been emptied from within of its humanity under centuries of cultural warfare against it. It appears that Islam, like everything else, has been reduced to but a shell, and Allah to but a word. It appears to me that the awe that Muhammad's perception inspired has abated. I see no evidence for it. This loss always happens universally when science becomes reduced to a religion, by which universal truth becomes meaningless. Astrid didn't argue my point. She agreed with me with a kiss and a smile, and then immediately added, as if nothing more needed to be discussed, that it was time to leave. We shook hands on that note and parted with those last few words still echoing in my mind. Thus, before I fully realized what happened, we were going our separate ways again.